Happy Thanksgiving. Would you say that to the person next to you? Happy Thanksgiving. Sometimes it's hard to feel Happy Thanksgiving when it's not Thanksgiving Day, when you can't actually smell the stuffing and the gravy cooking. But as you exit worship today and as you get close to the stairwell, I think you'll smell that rich cooking, and I think you'll feel a little bit more grateful as the smells kind of greet you there. But why is it that we give thanks? There are, of course, many blessings in each of our lives. But the thing that I think Christians are called to be grateful for the most is the gospel. The gospel is central to the church. So today, let's ask ourselves, what is the gospel that we are to treasure and be grateful for? What is the gospel that we're supposed to take to every nation and tribe? What is this gospel of Jesus? I think in order to understand what the gospel of Jesus is, it helps to understand the gospel of Octavian. A generation before the birth of Jesus, a good news about General Octavian was proclaimed throughout the entire Roman world. Up to that point, the Roman Empire was crippled by a lot of little civil wars because after the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Roman Republic lacked a dominant ruler and many wars were breaking out. Peace is almost always better than war. Most world leaders accept the rule of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, even though they don't look up to him and they don't approve of this dictator who used chemical weapons against his own people. They still allow it because even peace under Bashar is better than constant civil war. When General Octavian defeated the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the year 31 BC, it was therefore good news. It's not so much that people were really happy that Octavian was the winner. They were just happy that everybody else lost and that war would finally end. This was the good news of Octavian. Heralds dispatched to the major cities of the ancient Near East would say something like, "Hear ye, hear ye! Octavian has defeated the combined forces of Egypt and of Mark Antony, traitor to Rome. May all who are on the side of right celebrate this good news." At that point, the herald would look and everybody would cheer to show that they were on the side of the rightful king. The Gospel of Octavian implies, now that his victory is announced, all of you must fear him, rally around him, and turn away from every other pretender that dares to challenge his reign. The Gospel of Octavian is an announcement of his victory that demands a response from all who live in that kingdom. What then is the gospel of Jesus? The gospel of Jesus is also an announcement of victory. In the world full of warlords and oligarchs, a victor has emerged and all rivals have been destroyed. Hear ye, Jesus has defeated the forces of suffering and of evil. May all who are on the side of right celebrate this good news. And when this gospel is proclaimed, the people are supposed to respond. Either they will choose to celebrate and follow Jesus, or they will rebel and turn away from his rightful reign. Going to the nations with the good news of Jesus means that we're supposed to be heralds of Jesus' victory and call people to love and obey Jesus because that is what Jesus deserves. This call to proclaim gospel is an awesome calling we should treasure. But oftentimes, instead of proclaiming the biblical gospel of Jesus, Christians in their missions become insurance salesmen. Hey, you're really going to like this plan. It's the cheapest plan ever. It's not going to demand almost anything from you. All you have to do is check this box saying that you will intellectually assent to the statement of faith, and then go scroll down and then check this box. You're just committing to worship from time to time, not too much. And then check this box saying that you will give, some money, some time, what you think will show that you have a minimum amount of faith. We have turned the good news about Jesus into a good deal for the consumer. Hey, Bill, congratulations on signing up for basic coverage. I've got good news. I'm authorized to give you assurance that in the event of death, you will escape the horrors of hell and be able to enjoy the pleasures of heaven forevermore. But Bill, how about an upgrade? If you upgrade to our real member package, you get roadside assistance whenever you get stuck in life. We'll teach you how to use that Savior Link system so that in the case of emergency, you will know how to pray and connect with God. Of course, in addition to teaching people how to pray at church, we want to see more lives changing into that of a more mature Christian. So we might ask Bill to upgrade again. Bill, if you upgrade to our committed disciple package, you will get church representatives who will be there for you when you need help. And if you upgrade to our church pillar package, you get a bunch of people who will look up to you and give you the fulfillment of being at the center of a movement. We have turned the good news into a great deal. We have made the proclamation about the king into a pitch to the consumer. We've settled for increasing our market share and growing our institution instead of taking the gospel to make disciples of every tribe and of every nation. This perversion has happened because we have forgotten that the gospel is not about what we get. It's about what Jesus has done and therefore what Jesus deserves. That is what the gospel is about. It's an announcement of what Jesus did, the victory that he won, and therefore the rightful praise, adoration, and obedience that he deserves. That is the proclamation of gospel. When you tell people the gospel of Jesus, we're not supposed to jump to the benefits that come from believing in him. The first thing, the most important thing, is to tell people that Jesus, our warrior king, has been victorious. And our passage today, as mysterious and metaphorical as it is, our passage in Revelation tells us that when we proclaim the gospel, we must emphasize these three things. That the gospel of Jesus is glorious above all other sounds lifted high. That the gospel of Jesus is rigorous, like the sound of a staff sergeant's cry. And the gospel of Jesus is melodious, like the sound of a mother's lullaby. So that's the sermon for today. First, the gospel of Jesus is glorious. Let's read verse 6 together. Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. I was noticing in this verse that the angel is flying mid-heaven. Mid-heaven is not too high and not too low. It's high enough so that the angel is visible above all other barriers that block the view, but low enough so that the angel is clearly visible and audible. I was thinking mid-heaven, that's maybe the height where you guys know the small planes that tow banners? I think the height at which they fly is about mid-heaven. They like to fly about 1,000 feet above the ground because that'll give you clearance so that you can be seen above all the trees and buildings and hills. But it's still low enough so that the buzz of the engines causes people to look up and clearly see the sign that trails behind them. The point is that when this angel is proclaiming the gospel, it's flying at an optimal height so that the message will be clearly visible and impossible to block. It's saying that the gospel is so important and so victorious that nothing can block it. Nothing can obstruct it. Nothing can keep it down. Jesus says a city on a hill cannot be hidden. A burning lamp is supposed to be set up on a lampstand. What that means is it's not the job of a church to hold up the gospel. What Jesus really means is that what the church discovers is that the gospel is holding up the church. It's not like we explain and illuminate the gospel. What we're supposed to testify is that the gospel is illuminating us. The gospel is the light by which we experience and interpret reality. The gospel is glorious. In Christian apologetics, we say that we don't need to defend the truth of the gospel. The gospel defends itself because it's powerful, it's relevant and true and exalted. We don't have to add a soundtrack. We don't have to add pyrotechnics. The gospel will work to capture attention without needing promoters, without needing salesmen. But a lot of the times we forget how glorious the gospel is because when we share the gospel, it's often humbling and even humiliating. So there was this event that I was planning at my last church, and the event kind of failed. We said, hey, invite a couple friends. We're going to have free food, free drinks at this cafe that one of our members owned, and the person was willing to open it up for a couple hours. And so we said, all right, we're going to get one of our missionaries that we support to do sort of like live music, free food, and hear the missionary talk about the difference the gospel is making in India kind of session. And we said, all right, everybody, on Thursday night, bring a friend. And very few people came, and very few friends came. And so I thought, man, the missionary is here, has to share the gospel's impact on India, and no one's here to listen. And I decided to step onto Fifth Avenue at 25th Street and try to convince New Yorkers walking down to go into this place where they would be able to hear the difference the gospel is making in India. I spent about 20 minutes out there. I calculated about 1,000 people passed me by. And it was like not just being shot down, it was like being machine gunned down in terms of the amount of rejections I encountered. Every second was a rejection. You're looking and they see you. And it was like at the end of the commute, or it was the beginning of the commute time, so everybody was going in the same direction towards the subway stop. And I'm there like a little rock in the middle of a stream, and everyone looks at me, they're like, oh, it's one of the people I want to ignore. And they avert their eyes, and some people, they're talking on the phone, they literally give me like a stiff arm to just walk around me. So I'm there trying to say, guys, would you be interested in this? But I can't even get the words out because in that split second it takes for me to breathe, to say, excuse me, they're already gone. They've already chosen to ignore me, reject me. And I think you might have an experience like that too, where you're trying to communicate to people, believe in Jesus. Jesus has achieved this great victory, and that act is humbling. It's humiliating because there is so much rejection that comes at you so fast. The spiritual forces in this world will whisper accusingly, religion is a private matter. Keep your religious views to yourself. You will feel like you're intruding on others. You'll feel pushed to the margins. You'll feel pushed down. And you'll feel like, this gospel is something that maybe I'm supposed to share, I have to share, but I don't want to share. And nobody really wants to listen. And we think of the gospel and proclaiming the gospel as something that is very difficult to do. And that's why it's important for me to remember what verse 6 says about the gospel. That the gospel is something that is impossible to keep down. It's something that is impossible to obstruct. And it helps me to then wonder, well, if that's what the gospel is, why is my experience of sharing gospel so humiliating? And as I was praying through it this week, I thought, the number one reason why I get humbled and humiliated when I share the gospel is because I'm doing it wrong. When we are doing gospel sharing wrong, we are unbiblical in our proclamation or unprayerful in our methods. One of the most common mistakes that a church makes in proclaiming the gospel is to say, since I have the gospel and they don't, I have nothing to learn from them. It's to assume that you're superior in every way. It's to assume that they have nothing to teach you, that there's nothing to be inspired in their life, and you just have like a us versus them mentality. And we are privileged, we are valuable to God, and we are knowledgeable and wise, and they are heathen, and they're pagan, they're savages, and they have nothing to offer us. When we have that unbiblical view of what it means to hold on to the gospel and share it with others, then we are probably not prayerful, and we are very unbiblical in our assumptions about the gospel, which is why when we share with that kind of heart and mindset, God allows us to experience rejection and allows the world to hate on us because He wants to show us that we're being annoying and arrogant, that we are being shrill and self-righteous. So to correct the improper proclamation of gospel, God sometimes allows us to be humiliated and humbled. But I've also discovered that sometimes God has me experience rejection, even persecution, even when I'm trying to do it right as best as I can know how. And I think it's because part of the gospel is this declaration that while we were enemies of God, Jesus chose to lavish love upon us. So God allows the world to hate us and spit on us because praying attentively for those who ignore you and serving generously the people who spit on you is the way that we can proclaim the gospel of Jesus. God allows us to be rejected because to continue to serve while we are rejected is what it means to proclaim the gospel. When I share the gospel, I often feel awkward and confused and rejected. But that feeling of rejection is not meant to be the final word. We're called to pray again, plan again, and go out there and share again because we don't share the gospel because it feels good to do it. We go to declare the gospel because the gospel is true. And we are meant to be the heralds of the King, and His word is the final word. When we share the gospel with minds that are prepared and a heart that is purified, we will begin to discover that the gospel will not be ignored. The image of the angel flying in mid-heaven proclaiming the gospel reminds us that God will make the gospel visible. God will make the gospel unignorable. And finally, God will make the gospel undeniable. The grace of God being irresistible, the proclamation of gospel is undeniably effective when God is in it. And when we experience this to be true, when we see people that we thought, that person will never change, but we prayed for them, extend the gospel to them, and it begins to make a difference in their life and they come to faith, when we see that, we understand how glorious the gospel is. There is nothing that compares with the gospel of Jesus. Verse 6 calls it the eternal gospel. We can compare it with the Octavian gospel. The best thing you can say about Octavian's gospel is that his victory created 200 years of peace, the Pax Romana, before civil war broke out again. 200 years of relative peace versus what Jesus did. When Jesus achieved his victory on the cross, he defeated the forces of evil and of suffering eternally. It's an eternal victory. Because his sacrifice is infinite. It's enough to offset the debt incurred by sins committed in all of human history. His enemies are incapacitated permanently. The faithful are put out of the reach of the accuser forever. Octavian's entourage was just a construction crew that prepared the roads and infrastructure so that the gospel of Jesus could spread through all of Asia, Africa, and Europe within just the first 100 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Still, because it's not crazy cold yet, there's a lot of road crews working on our roads here in Michigan. And I realized that's what Octavian was. God used Octavian to make sure that the Roman system of roads was in place so that when the time came for the church to spread its message, that would exist. Octavian was great in the eyes of the world, but he's just a construction crew member in the story of Jesus and his eternal, glorious gospel. History has a story to tell, and it's a story of Jesus, and it's a glorious story. The second thing we experience about the gospel is that it is rigorous. The gospel demands a response. Based on the great victory Jesus has won, verse 7 tells us what we must do in response. The angel said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water." There's this idea of fearing God and of worshiping God. And I want to have that intention for you because fearing God becomes grotesque unless you also know that as we fear God, we're also meant to sing and dance joyfully before him. If you have a fear of God that keeps you from being able to experience joy, and instead, if you're If you can't experience ecstasy in the presence of God because you're too paralyzed by Him, you're fearing Him in the wrong way. The fear of God is not a joy-crushing fear. It's not a creativity-crushing fear. The fear of God means that we love, obey, and honor Him, but in a way that still makes us alive to be as creative, freestyling in our worship, and dancing just exuberantly, undignified before Him. That is the type of fear that God wants us to have. A fear that does not preclude that joy, that creativity of worship. At the same time, we're supposed to worship God, but to have that ecstatic worship, that creative and that personal and emotional worship be done in the climate of fearing, honoring, and reverencing God. So that our joy in worship, our intensity of worship, never makes us drunk in a way that has us ignore the reality of the one to whom every beat of our heart must obey. This idea of fearing God while worshiping Him and worshiping Him while fearing Him is what we are called to in verse 7. Another way to describe this combination of fear and worship is to see the union of duty and of desire in marriage. Marriage is more rigorous than a relationship with a friend or a boss because we have to combine both duty and delight in marriage. We have to make it our duty to serve our spouse with more sacrifice than with which we serve our boss. But at the same time, we also have to make it our delight to be with our spouse more than the joy we have when we hang out with our friends. May our faith in Jesus call us to honor our marriage vows anew. But may our faith also keep us from idolizing marriage. As we remember that marriage is just a metaphor for the actual relationship we're called to prioritize, our relationship with God. Next, we see that our discipleship must be rigorous in terms of purifying our hearts of the secret sins of coveting the pleasures that some sinners enjoy. And this is what we see in verse 8. Then another angel, a second, followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." The world invites us to commit spiritual adultery. The world tempts us with fornication. And we know it's wrong, but we also know that these sins come with a certain amount of fleshly pleasure. And so even as we say, "I'm a good person," there's a part of us, even as we maintain an outward obedience, there's a part of us that covets and fantasizes about the pleasures of following the ways of Babylon. But when we remember, as verse 8 declares, that Babylon will eventually be destroyed, and that all of these short-term pleasures of sin will lead to ruin and punishment, we will naturally begin to stop coveting the pleasures of sin, so that instead of just giving an outward, disciplined life of avoiding certain addictions, that we're able to recognize, I don't even want that. It's not that I'm not doing it, I don't even want it, because I recognize the truth of Scripture that this leads to destruction and punishment. When we learn to deal with the covetous hearts that we have, when we learn to put to death that secret fantasizing by the recognition that that leads to death, then we are becoming rigorous in our discipleship. Now let's turn to verse 9. Then another angel, a third, followed them, crying with a loud voice, "Those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads or on their hands." And this is referring to something that was talked about earlier in the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, it says that some people joined in the system that the beast instituted, not because they coveted the pleasures that the beast offered, but because they were afraid of the punishment that the beast would give. You know, there's in maybe junior high or high school, there are some kids who are like, I really want to experience the pleasure of drinking or of smoking, and that's why they do it. They want the pleasure of that fleshly sin, and so they do it. But there are some people, maybe more people, who join in because they're afraid of being excluded and punished if they don't do it. And that is the type of behavior that verse 9 is addressing. There are people who said that you have to receive this mark and bind to the system in order to be able to make any business deals at all. You can't buy or sell if you don't submit to the system. And people were afraid of being excluded. They were afraid of the punishment of exclusion. And so they thought, well, not because I want that pleasure, because I know that that's wrong, but if I don't do this, my life is going to be so marginalized. My life is going to be so difficult. I have to do this. And so they think, I'm going to do it because I'm afraid of the punishment of exclusion. And what does it say in verses 10 through 11? Those who conform to the world because they fear what the world can do to them, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger. And they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, and for anyone who receives the mark of its name. What it's telling us is, in the same way that we have to kill the coveting of the pleasures of sin, we also have to kill our fear at the punishment that the beast offers to us. We have to die to our fear, and that requires a rigor. And that means that as much as we're afraid of what exclusion can do to us, we also have to be more afraid of offending the righteous King who has been victorious over all things. We have to encounter how awesome Jesus is. We have to realize that there was no power that could hold him down. Jesus is so powerful that he made death tap out. When we are in awe of this Jesus, when we fear nothing besides Jesus, that is us experiencing a rigorous discipleship. Fear no one besides Jesus. Desire nothing above Jesus. Combine your duty and your desire to fear and worship Jesus. That is the rigorous response to the glorious gospel that makes us complete and mature. And today's passage ends with a melodious promise. Here is a call in verse 12 and 13 for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, as a spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them." I want to share with you a little bit of what my week was like. Last week, I received word that, 2 weeks ago, I received word from my brother that my aunt, who just turned 78, that she was sick, hadn't eaten in 5 days, and was probably going to decline in health more. And last week, I heard that she passed away on Thursday. And this week, yesterday, was her funeral. So my cousin asked me to preach for the burial service. And so I went yesterday, and I came back yesterday. And I was able to prepare words about my aunt. My aunt was a rigorous person. You know, some people, they work really hard and they make you feel bad and you're always thinking, I'm sorry because they work so hard. That was my aunt. She always did the right thing. She was so dutiful. Her father-in-law, her husband's father, was sick and she nursed him until he died. And promptly after that, her father became sick, and that bed that used to be occupied by her father-in-law became occupied by her father, almost back to back. And she did that. So after the hard part of raising 3 kids, then she had the 4th baby, which was her father-in-law, then the 5th baby, which was her own father. And then there was a little bit of, I guess, a little bit of rest where she was able to just live a normal life of doing the graveyard shift at the post office, sorting mail, and taking care of her kids during the day. That was when life was easy. When life was hard, she did the graveyard shift to care of the kids and also nursed while running on no sleep, her father-in-law and then her father. But she did it, and she did it to the best of her ability because she thought this is what it means to do what God asks us to do, to say yes to the duty that He gives and to covet nothing in the world. She had gone to the most competitive high school in Korea, and Yonsei, which is the second, I guess, prestigious school in Korea. And she was someone that was exceptionally brilliant. And then she had to sort mail for 25 years working for the US Postal System. And she was tempted to covet the pleasures of fame and of attention in this world. But she learned to put it to death because that is what a rigorous discipleship meant. And she said yes to not being afraid of anything that the world might do. And she taught her kids to forsake other worldly privilege for the sake of maintaining their worship of God. She did all the right things, more than I can hope to. But for the full year before she died, she was struggling with dementia. And by that point, she could recognize no people. And she spoke no words for a year because she couldn't remember anybody. And so there was no communication happening from her. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She was lost. And it made me wonder, even though here was this person who, through her resolve and through a rigorous discipleship, was able to reach to me like a standard of moral perfection. She wasn't perfect, but she was so good. She tried so hard. And she showed me that more is possible always. But when she died, close to her death, could she be confident in her ability to say, I know the gospel? Could she be confident in being able to say, I know I'm going to be saved because I believe the right things? Could she be confident by looking at a track record and saying, I do all the right things and so I can be confident I'll be saved? And the answer was no. She couldn't remember the gospel. She couldn't memorize any statement of faith. And she hadn't done any act of service for another person in so long. And she was needing so much help for such basic things. She was at a point where she could not trust in her belief. She could not trust in what she contributed to others. She had nothing on which to be able to say, I know my eternal future is secure, except to believe that Jesus would just be generous to her and save her. And that's what I realized God would do for her. And that's the promise God gives to each of us. We are able to rest from our labors. We're able to die and enter into a state of not being able to believe, not being able to do anything for ourselves. And to know that in that state of being dead, totally incapable, being unable to contribute anything, in that state of deadness, we are yet blessed. Because the gospel says that we who were once lost have been saved by the gracious gift that Jesus has given to us. And when we understand that, there's a natural, rigorous response, but it's not that rigor that saves us. The rigor is our natural expression of gratitude towards what has been freely given. And I think that for the most rigorous among us, we tend to forget what grace was at the beginning. The grace that inspired our rigor somehow gets lost as we stop looking at God and we start comparing other people who aren't working as hard as us. And I think that's why God took my aunt, who I thought should have a very nice closure to her life because she worked so hard. I expected her life to be easy in her golden years. But God saw fit to have her go from taking care of her kids to taking care of her fathers to taking care of her husband who got sick before he died and then battling dementia. Why did it go like this? I think it happened like that so that God could say to her, along the way of loving me and being rigorous in your discipleship, you've forgotten that even if you did nothing, and even if you couldn't memorize anything, and if you didn't know what you believed, I would yet love you and I would yet save you. And for her to relearn that, I believe God took her through this process. And that nature of God, which is to love us not because of what we do, but just love us, even though we are dead in our sins. That is the melodious lullaby that we hear in what it means to respond to the gospel. So may it be that when we proclaim the gospel to all the nations, that we hold all these things in tension, that it is a glorious announcement of a great victory that Jesus has won that causes us to delightfully, reverently, with duty and desire, give our best rigorous discipleship up to Him. But in the end, we discover that even when we fall short in our dedication and even in the clarity of what we believe, yet while we were sinners, while we did nothing, we were dead in our transgressions, He loved us. May that be what leads us to both rigor and rest today. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for the examples of the moral heroes in our life, the Aunt Marthas and others, the Mother Teresas, who show us by the rigor of their discipleship that having duty and desire unite to love and serve you is a beautiful, it's a powerful thing. But God, we also ask that you would help us to see that the gospel is not for the rigorous. The gospel is for the person who repents even though they've sinned the same way again and again. Help us to discover that the gospel is, the truth of the gospel is revealed in the life of that problem cousin or that black sheep of the family who is unable to get their life straight and is always causing problems for others. Help us to see that that family member is also displaying your gospel in a way. And help us to say, God, I would rather be an example of what it means to rigorously follow after you because that seems more pleasurable and that seems more joyful and life-giving and purposeful than showing your grace by living as the black sheep, always being lost and always doing what I promised not to do. God, but you have seen fit that some of our lives are exemplary and some of our lives are embarrassing. God, no matter what kind of heart you've given us, no matter what kind of cycle we're in, would you help us this day to be thankful because your grace is what makes us. Your grace gives us the strength to continue being consistent, and your grace gives us hope when we are lost in our failures. Help us to be able to say, we receive the gospel that is presented in the face of both types of people and their families. And when we see them this week around table, or when we video chat with them, or when we think of them, help us to remember to be grateful for the gospel of Jesus Christ that allows us to accept them as they are and to love them as they are. Would you lead us? Would you bless us? These things we ask in Christ's name. Amen.